You are listening to the Roberta Glass True Crime Report, putting the true back in true crime. From New York City, Roberta Glass is now on the record. I have a very special guest today, Tom, who is one of the administrators of the Facebook group 10 p.m. Praia de Luge, and we are going to be talking about the PJ files. So first off, welcome, Tom.
Hi, Roberta. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for doing this. So the most obvious question is, what are the PJ files?
When the investigation into Madeleine McCann's disappearance was archived in 2008, the case files were released to the public in accordance with Portuguese law, and these case files are known as the PJ files.
What is the difference between giving a statement to the Portugal police and giving a statement to the media?
Well, there are legal implications as such. You have to go to the police station and have your statement taken by a police officer. Then you have to read it and sign it as being true. And if you are lying or untruthful to the police, that can carry a very heavy penalty, especially in cases where there's a missing child.
So would it be equivalent to, say, perjury in the United States?
Well, depending on what your statement has caused, it could be obstructing the course of justice.
Okay. So what is the McCann parents, what is their official story surrounding what they call the abduction of their daughter, Madeleine?
Their story is that they put the children to bed at 7:30, and then they went out for dinner at 8:30 to the tapas bar, which was like a restaurant in a complex beside their apartment complex. They actually had to go out onto a public road and then into the tapas complex. And the children were asleep in a bedroom on the blind side of the apartment complex. So the window to the children's bedroom was on the opposite side of the apartment block, about 80 meters away.
Mm-hmm.
So they couldn't see the window of the children's bedroom. And the story is that they were doing checks every half an hour. And when Kate McCann went to check on the children at 10 p.m., they say she noticed that Madeleine was missing and raised the alarm.
So 10 p.m. How did their story change?
Well, if we go through the events surrounding the dinner and the alleged abduction, for which there is no evidence, they arrived at the tapas bar about 8:30, and then Jerry McCann did a check on the children just after 9. And straight away, we start to hit issues in the statements of the tapas 9 with Jerry McCann's check. So in his first statement, which he gave the day after Madeleine was missing, he said he entered the apartment through a locked door using a key. And the only door that you can lock and unlock with a key from the outside is the wooden front door at the car park. So then in his second statement, which he gave a week later, he told police that he went into the apartment through the unlocked patio door, which is a glass door on the pool side of the apartment. So we have two statements that are irreconcilable by Jerry McCann about how he entered the apartment on that night to do his check after 9 o'clock. Then we have the second check by one of their friends called Matthew Oldfield. He said he offered to check in place of Kate McCann around 25 past 9:30 that night. And there are certain issues around his check. For instance, in the timelines which they wrote out, which we'll talk about later on in the conversation, his check is missing off one of the timelines. I mean, it's very strange.
That is strange, yeah.
And the official narrative by the Tapas 9 stroke the McCanns is that when he went to do his check, he left the table with Russell O'Brien, which is another one of the men from the group.
Mm-hmm.
And Russell O'Brien is the guy that was writing out the timelines. So he wrote out a timeline and he leaves Matthew O'Field's check out of the timeline, even though he is supposed to have left the table with Matthew O'Field when the check occurred. So that's very strange. The staff working in the tapas bar said that they only saw the men at the table leave individually. So they didn't see at any stage two men from the group leave the table. And again, the narrative is that Russell O'Brien and Matthew Oldfield left the table together.
Mm-hmm.
So this is just the events up to when Madeleine apparently was abducted. Kate McCann then did the check at 10 p.m. And in her first statement, which she gave the day after Madeleine was reported missing, she said that when she entered the room, The door was wide open, the window was open, the curtains were open, and the shutter was open. And then a week later, she said that when she arrived in, when she got to the door of the bedroom, it slammed in her face. And then when she opened it, she went in, and then a gust of wind opened the curtains. And that's when she noticed that Madeleine was missing. But again, those two statements, they're different accounts of how she found the room at 10 o'clock.
In my understanding about those curtains is that they were tucked in, that a wind could not have blown them.
One was behind the bed that's against the wall at the window side of the bedroom, and the other was behind a chair. So it doesn't seem likely that the wind would have blown them open. And when we say blow them open, we're talking about the wind blowing them sideways along the rail.
She's given a demonstration of that check.
That's correct, yeah, they did a reconstruction.
Yeah, reconstruction, which is interesting because she won't go to Portugal to make her just reconstruct that little moment. And people have a very interesting reaction to it when they watch her reconstruct it. And most everyone that I know who's seen her do that, who's seen that little clip, has said, oh no. They've had a hard time believing it. So how were these timelines created and who created them?
So when the PJ arrived at the apartment just before 1 o'clock in the morning that night, Russell O'Brien and Jerry McCann and David Payne were essentially writing out a timeline of events. And what's very interesting is they did 2 drafts that night of the timeline, which again seems a bit strange, especially when they should have been out looking for Madeleine. And the first timeline that they wrote out, there's only 2 checks on the children. Jerry McCann checks, and then after him there's a 45-minute gap to 10 o'clock when Kate McCann checks on the children. That doesn't really make much sense to me. So that's the timeline that Matthew Oldfield's check is missing on. And then they wrote out a second timeline, and Matthew Oldfield's check, where he just sees the twins and the costs, is on that particular timeline. But missing from that is Jane Tanner leaving the table at 20 to 10 and Russell O'Brien coming back before 10 o'clock. So that was all included in a typed timeline that they put together a week later, and that was handed in to the PJ by a British liaison officer. So we essentially have 3 timelines, for want of a better word.
So the McCann's behavior also on the night of Madeleine's disappearance was significantly different. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, the issues on the night began before they left for dinner. So in their first statements, which they gave the day after Madeleine was reported missing, they told the PJ that they followed the daily routine before putting the kids to bed. And that involved bringing Madeleine to the children's play area beside the tennis courts. They went there as a family, normally before the kids were put to bed. So this is what they told the PJ the day after Madeleine was reported missing. Mm-hmm. And then a week later, the story changed. They said that the kids were too tired to go to the playground. So they just stayed in the apartment while Jerry McCann went and played tennis. It's one of the last things Madeleine would have done before she was reported missing. Going to the play area as a family, saying that one week and then the week later saying that the kids were too tired. You can't match those statements.
That would be something you would really remember, the last time we were together as a family, doing that thing we did every night, It's such an odd thing to me that they would say, oh no, that memory was wrong and she was just too tired. Your Facebook page is called 10 p.m. Praia de Luz. What is significant about that time?
Well, obviously, we've kind of brought it up already, as in that was the time that Kate McCann said she raised the alarm that Madeleine was missing. But there's actually 4 kind of important situations that were revolved around 10 p.m, and that's why the page has its name. So we have the McCann saying the alarm was raised at 10 p.m. Then we have the tapas staff saying that the table would have been empty in the restaurant at 10 p.m. because the staff say that it was between 9:40 and 9:45 when they left the table and the table was empty. Then we have 2 staff members in the Millennium restaurant. So there was another restaurant on the resort that's an 8-minute walk northeast of the tapas bar. And at 10 p.m, 2 members of staff say that several people, including an English tourist, entered the Millennium restaurant. And finally, we have the Smith sighting, an Irish family. 3 of them made statements that a man matching Jerry McCann's description was carrying a child matching Madeleine's description down a street, which is 4 minutes away from the McCann's apartment at 10 p.m. So we have these 4 important situations. 3 of them match up. The Smith sighting, the Millennium staff statements, and the tapas bar staff statements all match up. And the odd one out is the alarm being raised at 10 p.m. by Kate McCann. I think it's important to say again that, these were unbiased people, all these independent eyewitnesses. They went into police station, they gave their statement in private, signed it as being true. They didn't know what some of the other given statements were saying, and a lot of these statements corroborate each other.
I mean, it shows you that these statements are very hard to corroborate every detail. If you're recreating something, it's very hard, even if you think you have all your bases covered, to put in all the missing pieces. And when you have independent witnesses, they don't have any stake in lying, right? They don't have any motivation.
True, and they will also know, everybody knows, you can't go in and lie to police, and it's certainly about something as serious and significant as a missing child.
Mm-hmm.
So what we find is the executive chef said that he heard in the restaurant that a child was missing sometime around 9:20 p.m. that night, and this is corroborated by a man called Stephen Carpenter. His wife said she heard Madeleine's name being called out in the night sometime before 9:30 when they were walking home from the tapas bar back to their apartment that night.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got the statements matching up there that were given independently.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the empty table that the staff said was empty by 9:45 p.m. And then you have people going into the Millennium Restaurant, which is, as I said, an 8-minute walk away at 10 p.m. And you have the Smith sighting at around 10 p.m., which is a 4-minute walk away from the McCann's apartment. It's like all these things are possible and they all corroborate each other.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about Jane Tanner and what is her statement? What's called the Tanner sighting? What's that about, and what time she said that happened?
Yeah. So a significant part of the narrative for what happened that night is that Jane Tanner passed Jerry McCann talking to Jez Wilkins without them noticing her passing them on the street, and that she saw a man carrying a child away from the direction of the McCann's apartment around 9:15 that night. So it's a very significant part of the narrative. We go back and we start looking at the independent eyewitness statements, as I was saying earlier. The TAPA staff in their statements said that they only saw the men leave the table. So none of the staff saw Jane Tanner leave the table. And then she comes out onto the street in her narrative, and she says she passed Jerry McCann talking to Jez Wilkins, and she didn't say anything, and they say they didn't see her. But it's a very narrow street. It wouldn't be easy to pass somebody unnoticed. And Jez Wilkins in his statement said that he didn't think anybody could pass him unnoticed. And then I suppose, a very good point, and it was made by Isabel, your friend Isabel McFadden.
Mm-hmm.
Jane Tanner was wearing flip-flops that night, and it was quiet. And, flip-flops are quite loud, walking along a street like that. So it also meant that for some reason, as well as not seeing Jane Tanner, Jez Wilkins and Jerry McCann didn't hear her pass in her flip-flops.
And what does she say she saw?
She saw a man carrying a small child in pajamas and barefoot away in a easterly direction from the McCann's apartment at the top of the road. So we have the staff not seeing her leave the restaurant. We have the two men outside who say they didn't see her pass them on the street. And then it's very strange. The locals and the staff spent the whole night searching for Madeleine in Praia de Luge, and none of the Tapas 9 told anybody who was out searching that they should also be looking for possibly a man carrying Madeleine. They just let them search all night, which seems very strange to me.
Certainly.
If she had have seen this man. And then Jez Wilkins in a statement also said that Matthew Oldfield called to his apartment at 1 a.m. and said that Jerry McCann wanted to know what he had seen when they encountered each other on the street around the time of the Tanner man sighting. But the funny thing is, Matthew Oldfield didn't ask him if he saw a man carrying a child away from the apartment. He just told him that Jerry McCann wanted to know what he had seen.
Oh, that's interesting. That's very interesting.
Yeah, and at the same time, at 1 a.m., the PJ were with Jerry McCann in apartment 5A, the McCann's apartment. And he told police in a second statement that he was told about Jane Tanner's sighting at 1 a.m. by Russell O'Brien in the apartment. And the thing is, if there was two PJ officers present in the apartment at the time, it means that he didn't react because the PJ were there. So he didn't react if he was told at 1 a.m. Like, he didn't run to the street where the sighting is supposed to have taken place. He didn't run to Jane Tanner's apartment and ask her for more information. He didn't scream. He didn't tell the PJ officers at the time who were right beside him about the sighting. And he didn't tell his wife. It just seems pretty incredible. If he'd heard this information that one of his friends had seen a man carrying a child that looked like Madeleine away from their apartment at 9:15, that he didn't just stand up and run somewhere, to where the sighting was, or to the apartment of the person that allegedly saw this man.
The McCann's own reaction to this, they were looking for this Tanner suspect, Tanner sighting for years, hiring people, but they had no interest in the Smith sighting.
Yeah, that's correct.
So why do you think that the Smith man sighting is credible, and why do you think that it was Jerry McCann?
Well, it's not that I think it's Jerry McCann, but the evidence, it certainly indicates that it could have been Jerry McCann.
Okay.
If you take the fact that there's two witnesses that corroborate each other about the alarm time being sometime around 9:20, and then you've got two witnesses that corroborate each other to say the tapas table was empty at 9:45, and then you've got two eyewitnesses to say that in a restaurant that's 8 minutes away, walking, that people were in that restaurant looking for Madeleine at 10 p.m. So that all points to the alarm. The table being empty and the alarm being much earlier than the McCann narrative. Then this Irish family again, who are independent eyewitnesses, they described the man they saw, and his physical description and the child's description matched Jerry and Madeleine. And then one of the Smith's families actually gave a second statement to say that he was 60 to 80% sure it was Jerry McCann he saw that night. So I would say that the evidence certainly indicates it could have been Jerry McCann, because his whereabouts are questionable with all of these eyewitnesses that corroborate each other.
Can you talk about the state of Madeleine's room and her bed, and why some people feel that was maybe staged?
Again, this is another independent eyewitness, the cleaner. And I think maybe we might be able to put, or maybe on your page or something, a list of all. There's over 17 independent eyewitness statements that all of this can be based on as such. So the cleaner, 3 days after Madeleine was reported missing, she went into the police station. She gave a statement. And what people, I suppose, to picture now is the PJ files were not released when all of these statements were being made. So people didn't have access to the crime scene photos or anything like that. So if we look at the crime scene photo, we'll see that Madeleine's bed, and this is the bed that Matthew Oldfield couldn't see Madeleine in, was tucked in right into the corner along the wall near the door. And you had to step into the room to see if she was in the bed, which he didn't do. So the cleaner made her statement, and she was given a diagram by the PJ and asked about the state of the furniture in the children's bedroom. And what she said was that when she was in the apartment the day before Madeleine disappeared, that there was one bed pushed up against the wall and there was one cot in the room. So that's all that she said. She didn't see that the chest of drawers had been moved, or the chair that goes beside the chest of drawers had been moved. So if you look at the crime scene, the chest of drawers has been moved from one wall to another. From where it normally sits under the mirror in the children's bedroom, it's actually in the middle of a perpendicular wall. And the chair was moved from the corner where Madeleine's bed is in the crime scene, diagonally across to the other corner of the room. And why this is significant is that the McCanns say that they didn't touch the layout of the furniture after the day that they arrived 5 days earlier. So the cleaner's statement about the state of the furniture is different to what there was in the crime scene 1 day later. And if you think of that, means, according to her statement, Madeleine's bed was moved in to the corner where somebody would not see Madeleine from the doorway.
Oh, interesting.
So then you've got Matthew Oldfield's check where he didn't step into the room. And the cleaner, again, she was just, she went in and just gave a statement and left the police station, signed it as being true, and it paints a very different layout of the furniture in the children's bedroom the day before. The other thing is, there was no DNA belonging to Madeleine found in the children's bedroom, which seems extraordinary considering they were there 5 days at that stage. So the PJ tested both the beds for biological traces, and no DNA that could be attributed to Madeleine was found, which just seems pretty unbelievable.
Very unbelievable. I just remember those long holidays I took with my family. And by the 5th day, you're in and out of that place. Everything's being touched. It's sort of, I just remember as a child. So It's really unbelievable that no DNA would be found. And when people talk about this case from a certain perspective, they always say dogs don't lie, or they bring up Jerry McCann saying, ask the dogs. What are they talking about? Can you talk about what the dog alerts were, what they alerted to, and what that's about? What did the dogs alert to in 5A? And who were the dogs? And why were they brought in?
They were brought in on the recommendation of Mark Harrison, an expert from the UK. These two dogs, Eddie, the cadaver dog, and Keela, the blood dog, were considered like the best dogs in the world at what they do. Top of their field. So Eddie detects to the odor of cadaver. When we pass on, your body starts producing chemicals, and the dogs are trained to alert to the odor of those chemicals. Because dogs have 200 million cells in their noses, whereas we have 20, they can pick up these scents years later of cadaver and blood. So what happened was Eddie was brought into the apartment first. He also was brought into all the apartments of the Tapas 9, and he didn't alert anywhere except in the McCann's apartment. And he alerted to the cadaver odor behind the living room, near the wardrobe in the parents' bedroom, the veranda outside the parents' bedroom, and the flower bed below the veranda. Mm-hmm. And then Keela was brought in independently, and she alerted to the odor of blood behind the sofa in the same spot that the cadaver dog had alerted to. So we have two dogs independently alerting to odor behind the sofa in the living room, and some DNA belonging to Madeleine was found there, but they can't attribute it to any particular body fluid or anything like that. And then the dogs were brought to a car park where there was 10 cars, and one of those cars was the McCann's car. And Eddie, the cadaver dog, alerted to odor coming out from the door of the McCann's rental car. And Keela then later on alerted to the odor of blood in the boot of the McCann's hire car. So some DNA was found in the boot, and it was sent to the UK for testing. And 15 out of 19 of Madeleine's markers were found in the sample of DNA, which was they called a mixed DNA sample, because it was possible that there was up to 3 persons' DNA in the DNA sample from the boot. So we have Madeleine missing. We have Madeleine's DNA markers being found in 2 spots, one in the living room and one in the rental car, where both the cadaver and blood dogs alerted.
The arguments I've heard, the counter arguments to the dog, dismissing the dogs basically, is saying that, well, Martin Grimes, the handler, he could make them alert. He was leading them. What do you think of that?
Well, I'm no expert, but dogs are trained for all sorts, to recover live people who are in disaster zones. They can smell them out, survivors. Mm-hmm. They're used to find cash that people are, bringing through airports, drugs. And these particular dogs, no matter what people say, like Eddie, the cadaver dog, hadn't been wrong in 200 cases before this. What was interesting was the McCann say they found a case in the States where a cadaver dog had been wrong. But what is very interesting is that they never addressed the reputation of the 2 dogs that alerted in the apartment and the car in the case of their daughter that was missing. I find that hard to believe, that if you're going to question reliability, that you would look at the 2 dogs that are involved in the case where your daughter has been reported missing. Mm-hmm.
And the case that they picked out, everybody who's followed this case knows what happens with that case, which is the guy that confessed and said the dogs were accurate. It was thrown out.
In the end, yeah.
So it was a bad case to choose, Jerry McCann, because, this was a guy killed his wife, and it was 20 years later, not even really applicable, but the judge threw it out. But he eventually confessed, and he got very little time. I think like 10 years. But he said the dogs were absolutely accurate. It was amazing. So it's interesting. And the McCann's reaction themselves to the dogs was so interesting. Even if you say that they believe that this was an abduction, what it indicates is that their daughter is dead. And there was no grieving, no reaction, no sadness. They seemed to be angered by the dogs. And I can understand, but not even to acknowledge that this might indicate that their daughter is dead.
Or to follow the lead. Follow that lead and see where it brings you, where it clears the lead. Again, I just say it's very interesting that the reputation of the dogs in question was not questioned.
Mm-hmm.
They went and looked for another case.
Yeah. So the reason I wanted to review with you today everything that's in the PJ files is because this is what we're being asked to forget. Because the latest push or the latest news on the McCann case that's been in the press is that there's this German suspect, Christian Bruckner. There's not enough evidence to convict him, or there is enough evidence and he will be convicted, or this is finally the case is going to be closed with this new suspect. And to really do that, you have to forget everything that's in the PJ files, that it doesn't matter anymore.
Correct.
And then it's a whole new case. So does Smithman or Tannerman match any of the narrative that's being released in the press around Christian Bruckner?
So the first statement that was given out about Bruckner was that he had blonde hair back in 2007. And both sightings, the man had brown hair. And also, what's very interesting is nobody has, from law enforcement anywhere, has approached the Smith family to ask them, is Bruckner the man they saw? So they've heard nothing. Even though their statement is there, they have not been asked by any law enforcement, is this the man you've seen? So a journalist actually went to their house and interviewed them. They interviewed the father, Martin Smith, and he stands over what he said back in 2007. And he said that Bruckner is not the man he saw. As regards Tannerman, another man called Julian Totman has come forward to say that he thinks he's the man that Jane Tanner saw.
Uh-huh.
And that he was collecting his child from night creche. And it was him that she saw crossing the top of the road. But there's an issue there. So Tannerman was supposedly walking in an easterly direction across the junction. And Totman would have happened to be coming in a westerly direction to get to his apartment, which was just further down the road than the McCanns. So the direction there doesn't seem to add up, the direction he was walking in. But Tannerman has been cleared as this guy, Totman.
That's interesting because I'm just speaking for myself, I've always thought that she pulled that out of her imagination.
Well, if we go back to what we were talking about earlier, none of the staff saw her leave. Jerry McCann and Jez Wilkins didn't see her pass them on the street. Mm-hmm. You know, they let people search all night without saying that Madeleine could be with a man, being carried by a man. And we have Matthew Oldfield not asking Jez Wilkins at 1 o'clock in the morning, did you see a man carrying Madeleine from the apartment? And then Jerry McCann, if he was told at 1 a.m. by Russell O'Brien that Jane Tanner had seen a man carrying a child away from their apartment, that he didn't react. So the evidence certainly suggests that the Tanner sighting didn't happen. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a lot of corroborating evidence there.
Sure.
The thing with the Tanner sighting is there isn't a statement in the PJ files that corroborates the sighting.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
And another interesting point, I actually spoke to Isabel McFadden about this. Mm-hmm. The media said that Totman talked to the GNR, which were the initial police that arrived before the PJ took over the scene. And they said, the media were saying that several days after Madeleine was reported missing, that Totman gave a statement to the GNR. But I spoke to Isabel and she was saying that there is no way the GNR would have taken a statement off Totman a few days after Madeleine was reported missing, because they're very strict about this in Portugal. They would have directed him to the PJ immediately. They wouldn't have taken a statement. They would have sent him to the PJ for them to take the statement. Hmm. So there's no statement that corroborates Jane Tanner's sighting in the PJ files. And there are staff that corroborate each other in the tapas restaurant. Jerry McCann and Jez Wilkins corroborated each other outside, that they didn't see her outside. They didn't hear her flip-flops on the street. It was quiet.
You know what strikes me so about that sighting, I guess makes me uncomfortable about it, is that it goes against human nature. If you know someone, you're passing them on a street, even if they're in intense conversation, you're going to at least nod and make eye contact. You know, it just goes against human nature to walk by and say nothing. And even if their backs turned, you don't see them, someone's going to acknowledge someone on a small street. It just, I guess I've kind of changed my opinion on this, or changed what I consider is really important about this case, is that they never searched. To me, that is the most amazing thing about this case, and combined with everything else that's in the PJ files, that the McCanns never searched for their daughter. It's just so uncomfortable for me.
Well, that actually, so you kind of got into an area there that's very interesting, is they were writing this timeline when they should have been out searching.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And what's very interesting with the timeline, and I mentioned it earlier, is especially the first one they wrote out, what seems very important is that the alarm is 10 p.m. So, one of the timelines, it's missing Matthew Oldfield's check, but it's still a 10 p.m. alarm, and there's 45 minutes there where there's no check. What happened? So they didn't, in their timeline, it just stops abruptly at 10 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
And you would imagine if they were helping police that you would have pretty much written everything down that happened all the way up until when the police actually arrived in the apartment.
Mm.
And we don't hear about what happened after the alarm until all the rogatory statements were given 1 year later, where 7 of the friends were brought into the police station in Leicester and they gave statements about what happened on the night. So this is the first time that we hear the Tapas 9 talking about what they did around the alarm, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So what they all say happened was when Kate McCann came to the table and said that Madeleine was missing from her bed, like all of them were parents. They all ran to the McCann's apartment and stood outside. They didn't run to their own apartments, and they'd left their children alone in an apartment block, which was in a different complex, and they hear a child is missing. I mean, I think parental instinct would be, oh my God, is my child okay? And you would run to your own apartment first and just see your loved one in their beds. But they didn't. They ran to the McCann's apartment, which seemed to indicate to me that they weren't worried that there was any risk to their own children.
That's so interesting because this is not equivalent. I'm not equating a cat with a child, but I don't have children. I just have cats. And I remember when the doorman said to me, "Oh, we have a cat that's loose on the roof. Is that your cat?" And I ran up to my apartment and I made sure my 2 cats are okay. But I didn't keep my eyes off them all night. I was just so grateful that they were okay.
Yes.
Just that feeling like I was worried for a little while there that somehow they jump out the window and get on this, the roof. And I was terrified. So I think that's a great point. Just there's so much instinct in this story and in their narrative that doesn't really, I don't know, click, make sense.
I would say that parental urge to protect your children is uncontrollable, I would say.
Yeah.
And I just find it hard that the couples didn't even split up and that one of them ran to their apartments to make sure that their children were okay. There's other issues around what happened that were after the alarm. So there was a search of the beach by 3 of the men, Russell O'Brien, David Payne and Matthew Oldfield. And what's strange is that the 3 of them have completely different accounts of what happened with the search of the beach. So Russell O'Brien said he searched the beach with David Payne and Matthew Oldfield, and that they split up into a team and took a section of the beach each, okay? And David Payne said he went down to the beach on his own and searched the whole beach by himself. And then Matthew Oldfield just said, I went down onto the beach and then returned to the apartment. So you've got 3 completely different accounts of 3 of the men searching for Madeleine.
Which would be, how often do you search for a missing child? That should be crystal clear and congruent.
Well, if you say you're with somebody and they're saying they were on their own,
right.
And one person saying that they split the beach up into 3 and they took a section each, and then another guy is saying, I searched a whole lot on my own. Like, they're irreconcilable differences.
Certainly.
It also, the time of the call to police is 10:41 p.m. That's obviously easy to get because it's in the telephone records. The call was made from the main reception of the Ocean Club, which is the name of the resort that they were staying in. But the thing is, so Matthew Oldfield in his rogatory statement told police that after the alarm, and they went outside the McCanns and then they checked their children, that Fiona Payne asked him to go to the main reception and have the police called. So he said he went there and he came back and then he did some searches. And then he went back to check again and came back. And again, I think it would be good if we can get these independent eyewitness statements up.
Sure.
The guy that was on reception did not receive Matthew Oldfield into reception to ask for the police to be called. So you've got an independent eyewitness saying one thing and Matthew Oldfield saying another.
Wow. I will have up all the independent eyewitness links on my Facebook page. I don't know if you'll want to put them up on 10 p.m. Praia Deluge. It's okay if you don't or do. I can also put them in the show notes.
Sure.
So that people can really read them and examine them themselves.
There's one or two maps I think we should put up as well. We'll just show you, where the Millennium Restaurant is, where the Smith sighting was, the McCann's apartment.
Okay. And
then the orientation of the tapas restaurant and the children's bedroom. The page has some very clear maps on these issues. And what's also a very nice little map that's up on the page is going back to the conflicting statements of Jerry McCann, where 1 week he said he entered the apartment through the wooden door at the car park, and then he entered the second statement, he said he entered through the glass patio door. There's a map of the street, and what's interesting is, in his first statement, he had to pass the entrance that he said he used in his second statement to get to the wooden door. So if you picture, he's recalling what happened, and as he's picturing himself doing the check, in his first statement, he walks by the entrance that he used in the second statement. And I just want to clarify that everything we've spoken about here today is evidence in the PJ files. It's no speculation or looking at media. Mm-hmm. It's everything that we've talked about today, which we'll put the links up. It's all in the PJ files. And I think the public, it's amazing, the public still aren't aware that these files are out there. Mm-hmm. So people need to read them if they want to find out the truth.
And they're in English, right? They're translated.
They're translated, yes. Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else that we missed that you think you'd like to discuss?
This is quite extraordinary. Jerry McCann was talking to the neighbour upstairs, Mrs. Fenn, after the alarm had been raised. And she leaned over her balcony and said, "What's going on?" And Jerry McCann said, "A little girl is missing and the police have been called." But put it this way to you, if you came home from work and somebody had kicked the headlight of your car in and you saw your neighbour in their garden or at their balcony, your instinct would be to say, "Did you see anybody around here? My headlight's damaged." Right. Okay? Mm-hmm. Jerry McCann didn't ask Mrs. Fenn if she saw anything. And she was there while they were eating in the tapas bar. I mean, he didn't ask her, "Did you see anybody hanging around? Anything strange? Did you hear a scream? Strange noise?" He asked her nothing. Wow. Which just seems like a strange, like that parental urge to find your daughter, to find out what's wrong. That when you see a neighbour, you just don't straight away just go, "Did you see anything?"
It's amazing.
Anything that could help.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's a witness. It's a witness super close to where you say this abduction happened. So.
Well, she was upstairs. Like she lived in the apartment above 5A.
Right.
So it was possible she could have even heard a scream or something, but she wasn't asked anything.
Wow. Tom, thank you so much for talking to me about this. It really gives such a clear idea of some of the statements that are in the files and why there's so many people who continue to be interested in this case and continue to hope that the truth comes out.
Well, when you look at the independent eyewitness statements, they do paint a linear picture of events that are a bit different to what the McCann narrative is. Mm-hmm. And the issue with the McCann narrative is that there's so many contradictions in their statements.
Right. Really appreciate it, Tom. Thank you so much. Where can people find you?
Do a search on Facebook for 10 p.m. Praia Deluge.
Is it a follow the page or is it a group page?
It's just a page, but it has a contents, so you can kind of glue a post to the top of the page, mm-hmm. and there's a contents page with links to about 40 or 50 articles on the evidence in the PJ files, and all the page deals with is evidence in the files. That's all the page deals with, nothing else but analysis.
Excellent. Thanks so much.